Truth Espresso, episode 111.
Face it, we all would rather sleep in this morning. That's why God gave us espresso, to kickstart our zombified corpses into hyperdrive. And now, giving your mind and soul the morning shot of truth it craves. This is Truth Espresso with Daniel Minnick.
Hey there, Truth Espresso listeners. This is your host, Daniel Minnick, coming at you with yet another episode of Truth Espresso. Now, my voice sounds a little bit lower in this recording, and that is because I am still just getting over a head cold that I got this last week. And if you've been listening to the last several episodes, my wife and I have been doing a series on marriage, and so we were planning the next episode in this series, but we decided to give our voices a little bit of break so we can fully recover from that. And so what we're going to present to you is actually an interview that I did with Eric Luppold of Governed by God. And Governed by God is a member podcast of the Christian podcast community, along with Truth Espresso. And so this was an interview among friends. And I highly encourage you to check out Governed by God with Eric Luppold. He has a lot of good insight into biblical law there. And each of his episodes will usually study a law of God from the Bible at the beginning and then have an interview with someone on a topic related to God's law. Or Eric will talk about some of the politics going on in his home state of Pennsylvania and how these politics go against biblical law. And so I've checked out quite a few of his episodes. They're very informative, and so I once again encourage you to check out Governed by God with Eric Luppold. I will provide a link to Governed by God in the show notes, as well as a link to the episode that Eric originally aired that featured this interview. Now, this was Eric interviewing me, and we recorded this back around May. And even at that time, I was still recovering from COVID. So yes, I got that nasty, dreaded COVID-19. And to tell you a little bit about that, at the time when I got it, the symptoms that I had were, I would say, a little milder than the typical cold. And so I didn't feel as beaten down by it. The only issue that I had with COVID was that I coughed myself enough that I pulled my chest a little bit. And so coughing really hurt my chest. And at that time, it was kind of difficult. So that was the hard part of it for me, not the actual symptoms of COVID. But Eric and I had been trying to work out a discussion together in April, and then when I got COVID, we had to reschedule a little bit, and then, just things would keep coming up, like we had to keep on pushing it to the next week, and it was taking a while for me to manage my cough, and eventually we were able to bite the bullet and do our discussion, and I still had a little bit of problems dealing with a lingering cough, and so you might hear that a little bit in this interview, but Eric, in Governed by God, wanted to talk to me about biblical money. Yes, I know that doesn't sound like a very interesting topic, but yes, the Bible has a lot to talk about money, and what we weren't talking about was personal finance, not how to do a family budget, how to keep yourself out of debt per se. It was more about macroeconomics according to the Bible, the politics of how the government tries to manipulate the economy by controlling money. And so discussing how the Bible defines what a good money is, how the Bible defines rather a stable money with equal weights and measures, and how pretty much everything that the government does today when it comes to our monetary system leads to corruption and is not how the Bible defines things, and that if we went back to the biblical definition and the biblical understanding of a sound money and how the supply should not be able to be counterfeited and manipulated by the control of a government or some kind of central bank that's able to keep interest rates artificially low, prime the pump, do stimulus, whatever, or prevent bank runs by printing more money and stuff like that. Yeah, none of that's biblical, as I hope you'll see in this discussion. And Eric and I both believe that if enough Christians understood this and that we held politicians' feet to the fire, and that if enough people understood this, why the current monetary system is corrupt and evil and is really a form of slavery. It robs what people have earned and gives that ability to purchase the goods and services created by the market to insiders, those connected with the government and the banks and favored corporations, and provides a virtually endless money spigot for the government to spend on things they like say, unbiblical causes, social causes, keeping themselves reelected and making promises of stealing what belongs to other people in the name of welfare and caring for the poor and whatnot, and getting people to vote for them and so on. So lots of stuff that we understand that is corrupt is enabled to be corrupt because of a misunderstanding of what money is and what it should be, as we believe the Bible makes clear. And there are times when Israel disobeyed God in this regard, and God even sent them into captivity because of it. So I think it's very important, according to God's law, that we respect the poor, we respect the laborer, and we respect that what you earn is yours. And that if the government can simply just create new money and buy things, it is a redistribution of wealth. It is theft that has just the same effects as a high tax on labor and on income, but it's worse because it's more insidious. And the educational system has brainwashed a lot of people to think this way. And so, without further ado, enjoy this discussion as I was interviewed by Eric Luppold of Governed by God.
So today, I had the opportunity to interview Daniel Minnick, who is the host of the Truth Espresso podcast, also part of the Christian podcast community, of which Governed by God, my podcast, is a part of. Daniel Minnick is a software engineer, has a bachelor's degree in computer science and a master's in information systems. Now, Truth Espresso, on that podcast, he covers a lot of different topics, a lot of different worldview topics. And one such topic that I found particularly interesting on his podcast is that of economics. Daniel has a wonderful brain. He can think things through way better than I can. And so the topic that we're going to discuss together is that of economics, money, debt, and basically some of the problems that we see in the United States and America regarding our economic system and the things that are going on with it that are unbiblical. And so we do take a look at some of the laws in Scripture regarding that. So I really do hope you enjoy this discussion with Daniel Minnick from Truth Espresso. And if you want to take a look at his podcast, just go to truthespresso.com. That's truth, TRUTH, and then SPRESSO.com. And without further ado, my discussion with Daniel Minnick. All right, Dan, I really appreciate you joining me this evening to have a good conversation on the topic of economics. It's obviously a very broad topic, and just for our listeners out there, you're the host of Truth Espresso, and I've had a chance to listen to a couple episodes and have really appreciated it. And so I'm glad to have you on the show today here on Governed by God, because you and I kind of cover some of the same topics regarding how law, government, economics should all fall under Scripture and God's standard for living. So I kind of just wanted to open it up to you, being someone who, you're very familiar with economics and some of the unbiblical things that are happening in our culture today. More specifically on the American issue, what do you see as some of the big problems, the big unbiblical issues economically in our culture?
Well, yes, first of all, thank you, Eric, for allowing me to be on your podcast, Governed by God. And as you said, we have a lot of similar interests there, and seeing the world through the lens of God's law as he spells out in the Bible. And when it comes to the issue of economics, I think that it's a very deep and complicated issue that I really wish a lot more people would understand. Basically, economics is kind of like, if you think of it like an onion, there are a lot of layers to it. But when you peel back the layers and get to the core, economics is very simple. Yeah. And it all comes down to the idea of what is money and what is the purpose of money and what would be honest money versus a dishonest money. And so I think when it comes to economics and all the problems that we see when we see like rampant government spending on doling out favors to corrupt organizations, helping government bureaucrats and banks helping out their friends while basically leaving the average person high and dry. I think all of it ultimately gets traced back to, why is that even possible? And the reason it's possible has to do with the whole money system that I believe departs from what the Bible prescribes as far as what is an honest money and what is a dishonest form of money, and the monopoly on money.
You mentioned some of the spending from the government, and obviously, we're a year plus into this pandemic, and now many of us have gotten multiple stimulus checks, and a lot of people that I talk to, they don't really see any problem with it per se, or they're not really bothered by getting the money. I mean, the only thing that really bothers them is if they don't get it. So, as long as they get it, they're cool with it. And I don't know, and I imagine you've had some similar conversations, but I try to get people to think about that money, like, it just doesn't come out of thin air. It's not really real, and there's going to be problems in the future. So it's kind of that topic of fake or fiat money. Can you speak a little bit about the problem that you see with this kind of spending and essentially printing of money by the government?
Yeah. So first, I'd like to come up with a definition of money, just so we know exactly what we're talking about. The definition of money that I came up with for my podcast, Truth Espresso, is any good, whether tangible or intangible, whose primary use is as a medium of exchange. And so money is basically what facilitates transactions. It's anything that's in the middle of trading different goods and services. Basically, it gets in the middle of barter and makes barter essentially easier. And if we want to look at what a biblical money is, we look at the characteristics of a money. So technically any good can be used as a money, because I said it's a good, but certain characteristics make some things better suited as money. These characteristics are that, number one, it's relatively scarce, so if everyone lives at the ocean and you try to use sand as money, that's not going to work very well, because you can't even contain how much sand you use that would make it valuable for transactions. So relatively scarce. Another number two, it's portable. You need to be able to carry it around. Otherwise, it makes it hard to transact in a marketplace. Number three is it's divisible. Number four, it's fungible. In other words, every unit of money has the same value as any other unit of the same denomination. Number five, it's durable, like say, dirt or something that can erode or wither is not going to last long, and therefore if a good is durable, that makes it work better as money, so you could store it longer, you can save it, and you can plan your spending when you need it. And then finally, which this I think is important for biblical money as opposed to the system we have today, number six, is that money has utility. In other words, it has valuable uses. Like, so what makes something a good money is that it itself is a good that has, factors like, say, for instance, if we take gold, gold isn't just shiny and beautiful. It also is, it's malleable. You can shape it. It conducts electricity. It's used in products like USB devices. And so the reason people found something like gold valuable is that it actually has uses, it has utility, and that's how it became historically valuable for money. So I mentioned that there are many things, agricultural produce, wampum, seashells, large stones, precious metals, and paper have historically been used as money. But what things have been time tested, that people have used for thousands of years, as the Bible shows, are things like gold and silver, because they have all of those features, those characteristics of a good money. And so
you would say that, it seems like these six rules, or these six characteristics, I should say, they make sense. But is it the case that they just kind of happened naturally as humans engaged in commerce with each other, that it just so happened, I don't like what I guess I'm trying to say is somebody in the ancient world didn't just sit down and say, okay, look, I need something that does this, 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 and this, and this. And then he goes through his list of items, piece of rock, no, cow, no, piece of wood, no. And then he lands on gold. Or is it more just it naturally came about that over time, generally speaking, throughout the world, gold and silver, precious stones, rose to the top as far as the best forms of money, medium exchange, because of those qualities, but it's not that somebody was explicitly trying to find those qualities. Does that make sense?
Yes, money is definitely an indirect, unintentional discovery of natural free market processes. And we have the revelation of God. And if we look at Genesis chapter 2, verses 11 through 12, we see that God created money naturally, even if he didn't just dictate down from heaven to some kind of government and say, you will use gold and silver as money. But from the start, naturally, we see it says the name of the first, referring to rivers, that is it which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. There is bdellium and the onyx stone. And so we see that God created things, if it seems like he intended them to be discovered and used naturally as money. And so, as I mentioned, people used different things that might have had one or two or several of the characteristics that make sense as money, but it seems like God naturally created things, gold, silver, precious stones with their characteristics that makes them naturally suited as money, but he never set up anything that would be like a central government and dictated to them, you will create the money and you will control the money and the supply of money.
I bet you this is probably a very in-depth question, but how did we get, in a way, I mean, maybe in a nutshell or in 5 minutes or less, like from that idea to where we are today, as far as like now we just go around handing these pieces of paper with people's faces on it, and we as humans think that has value, or even we just use digital ones and zeros, credit or electronic money. Like where did the disconnect happen, or how did it come to this?
Yeah, it's definitely a complicated answer that would be needed for that question. I mean, I can give kind of a hypothetical story, where obviously the invention of paper and the printing press, I think it was the Chinese who actually invented paper, was a good thing for the economy because, allows us to keep records better. It's better for writing and printing things and books, disseminating information. And I would say that there's nothing wrong with using paper itself as a currency as long as we understand how it should be limited. It's like, so if we're going to use paper, really we should use it. And in history, it was used as a money substitute. In other words, a bank, like people would store their gold or silver at a bank, and then the bank would issue what were called warehouse receipts in paper. And the paper itself, it's a lot lighter. It's much more portable actually than gold and silver. And, maybe if someone on the street sees a bag with shiny stuff, on your person, you might have more of a risk of getting mugged and robbed. So paper, the warehouse receipts made it much easier to carry money. And then because it represented gold and silver in a bank, the warehouse receipts would be treated as a substitute for the money. And so people would exchange these warehouse receipts for goods and services, because the person who bore the note would know that he can take that warehouse receipt to a bank and redeem it for the gold and silver. And so, there is a role that things like money substitutes, instruments such as paper, can play a role in facilitating commerce. But then the problem happens when the banks realize that they could try to get away with lending out more paper, printing more paper than they actually have money in the vault. And that's exactly what has happened throughout history. And then when people start to get suspicious that maybe the bank, it was not being honest and they didn't really have their money in safekeeping at the bank, they would try to come to the bank to get their real money and redeem the receipts. But if there's more receipts than there is money in the vault, then you have a bank run and you have a difficult situation, and that exposed the problems with the bank. But today people think the best way to avoid a bank run is to insure deposits. We have what's in the United States, what's called the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, to ensure that banks can use inflation to give you your money back. But that's not really the solution. The solution is honest money, that your receipts should represent real money, such as historically what was gold and silver.
So you can't go to the bank today and get some gold or silver by turning in your banknotes.
Yes, not anymore. Historically speaking, in the United States, the certificates, the money used to say that you could redeem it in gold at the bank, but no longer, because the United States went off the gold standard, and, we could get into history of that, such as, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal programs and his efforts to expand the money supply. He knew that his spending would result in inflation, so then he had the gold confiscation laws. People weren't allowed to have gold because, that would prevent the government from being able to expand and spend money on projects in their false notion that was what the economy needed. Actually, it was theft from the labor of the citizenry. But then gold was actually illegal to hold. Wow. There until after, until the 1970s, but then that would, we'd get into the history of the wars and the Bretton Woods Accords and stuff like that. But.
Yeah. So obviously we can't get gold today. Well, you can still get gold, but not at the bank. You said that per the FDIC, you have a situation where the bank has this money that it gets from its patrons, its customers, and then it's hoping that not every single person comes back for their money at the same time. So it's kind of taking a little bit of a risk or a gamble, and it's a little dishonest, obviously, and it uses that money, it spends it or loans it or whatever. But like you said, if everyone runs on the bank, the FDIC, is that basically nothing more than another higher bank? The federal bank just promises to backfill the other bank with the cash? Like, how does that work?
Yes, originally, I believe when it was established, it would insure deposits up to $10,000. Now it's been $250,000 for quite a while. So if you have one bank account that you have millions of dollars in, if somehow there were a bank run, you would only get $250,000 insured, to replace it. But that is the solution that the government provides to avoid bank runs. But of course, I believe that's not the correct solution.
Yeah, because is it nothing more than just deception and theft? Like, what makes it? Is that why it's bad?
Yeah, I mean, this would go back to the legalized institutional practice of fractional reserve banking. I mean, fractional reserve banking was kind of something that, banks tried to do and get away with, but now with the central bank, especially the Federal Reserve System that started in 1913, now you have legalized, institutionalized fractional reserve banking as the engine for the economy. And what fractional reserve banking is that a bank can lend out money, that more money than it has in reserves in its vault. So let's say, you have what's called the reserve ratio that the Federal Reserve sets. And so if, say, for instance, the reserve ratio is 10%, that means that the bank is required to have in its vaults 10% of the cash that in total it lends out to borrowers. So it could lend out, 9 times, if I'm calculating correctly, what it has in the vaults. And so definitely that you'd see like, well, that should cause a bank run, but now that it's institutionalized and people don't understand what's going on, then the banks are making money and with their loans and inflating the supply of money, which we could talk about what inflation is and what the Bible says about it. Yeah. But, basically it's like our purchasing power, how much we could buy with $1, it gets spread thin. We can buy less with it as the banks end up getting more of the purchasing power because they could lend out, they can create new money and lend out what they don't have, what they haven't earned. Yeah. And we get to use money that we have to work to earn and see it's purchasing power stolen from us.
Yeah. So that's what I wanted to go to next, because whenever especially with these stimulus checks and you're getting the government spending trillions of dollars and no one seems to bat an eye at it. And I just inform people like, well, I can't see how it's going to avoid inflation, because it just seems like the money is coming out of thin air. It's not money that we've saved in kind of like a rainy day fund. Like maybe it'd be one thing if the government had a balanced budget and we had a surplus and we had 10% every year saved for the rainy day fund. And then rainy day happens, pandemic, and now you have $2 trillion saved. That's actually legitimate real money that you can actually, spend as you see fit. But what's happening here is we're in debt. We have a deficit. We spend more than we take in. And then we're just going to create more money out of thin air. And what I tell people kind of tongue in cheek is that it's nothing more than Chuck E. Cheese tokens. Like it's just not going to go very well. It's going to diminish the value, which I try to explain inflation, but maybe for my listeners, you can please explain how that is inflation and how inflation is a damaging thing.
Yeah. So when I mentioned what qualifies as a good money, one of the features is that it's relatively scarce, and built into, say, gold and silver, that has to be mined, and that they're relatively scarce metals, so they hold their value. They can't really be manipulated as easily. But inflation is at least historically defined, which is the definition I'm holding to. Inflation is an increase in the supply of money that ultimately results in an increase in prices. Now, when you hear economists today talk about inflation, mostly they talk about rising prices, but that's not what inflation is. Inflation is a monetary phenomenon. It has to do with the supply of money itself, which results in rising prices. But by focusing on defining inflation now as just an increase in prices, they hide the cause of it. But so now, what is the effect of this when the money supply is increased? Inflation doesn't simply mean that the government creates new money and then distributes the results in proportion to what everyone has. In other words, if the government doubles the money supply, it's not as if everyone's money holdings simply double. That would make inflation really have no other effect than to adjust price figures, and everyone would still be as wealthy as before. But that is far from what inflation actually is. Inflation in practice is no different in effect than counterfeiting. Those who have the legal privilege to print new money at will can benefit themselves and their favored parties, all their friends. The counterfeiter or his friends who get this new money can, of course, buy goods and services at their current prices. And as they buy a portion of the supply of goods and services, and their counterfeited money circulates, prices eventually adjust to reflect the new ratio of the money supply to the currently available supply of goods and services. So the counterfeiter and their favored friends benefit from this because they get free goods and services with the money that they create. But who loses? It's those who do honest work and are not connected to the scheme. What they earn for their work will tend to lag behind the the increase in prices. This is really a theft of labor. Any savings that they have worked to set aside becomes less valuable as each unit of money can buy less. So it really is theft.
Yeah, I was just trying to think about, in its simplest form, kind of like if I was in my basement with a printing press that could print counterfeit bills. Let's say I get like $1 million. I made $1 million. And no one else knows that. And now I can take advantage of the fact that the market, the prices of a car, of a house, or whatever, they're all the same. But as I start buying all this stuff and the money starts to go out into the world, then, as I'm buying more and more stuff, the prices of those items will raise. So I get the benefit of the low prices at the beginning. So I get all the stuff. And then as my money starts going out into the market, those people, they get more money. Maybe they're able to buy some stuff at a decent price before it rises high. But the person at the very end of the whip or of the rope, the prices have all increased. The market is already adjusted when they're finally seeing the money, if you will. And so those people are the marginalized, the ones that get hurt the most, which are, I guess, I would assume typically the poor, because the first people that are getting the money from the big injection from the government are like people that need the big loans, corporate, big business, that kind of stuff. But the average laborer who's poor isn't going to see that until the prices have all raised. Is that a fair understanding?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what inflation does and who it affects. Those who are connected to the scheme get cheaper goods and services, or even free goods and services, because they create the money. And then because the prices rise as the money supply grows and prices readjust, those who are on fixed incomes, the working middle class and poor, those who save money, and the fatherless and the widows, as the Bible talks about a lot, they're the ones who suffer the most from this scheme of counterfeiting, legalized, monopolized counterfeiting.
Yeah, and I also was thinking of the folks that are, because you mentioned the widow, but the folks that are retired too, because
yes.
They worked all their lives, and they are, let's say they invested or saved several $1 million, and they're living off the interest or whatever, but they planned their retirement off of a certain cost of living and a certain level of lifestyle that they wanted to have. But as they see prices increase and they're not getting any more money because they're retired, then they're the ones that suffer, and they realize that their plans are being overturned or upended by the, like you said, the deception and the cheating of the other people. Is that fair?
That's exactly what happens. And, it's like I say, I wish a lot more people understood this, and especially Christians really need to understand this, because this violates God's law. It violates the 10 commandments, thou shalt not steal. And if inflation, counterfeiting, is stealing the honest labor from other people, it's robbing them of what they've worked to earn. It's a transfer of wealth, redistribution of wealth from those who produce the money, from those who actually work to produce the goods and services that back the money. Essentially, it's theft. And so it directly violates God's law. And there's even there's passages in the Bible that we can definitely see oppose inflation as dishonesty, and some of these things are some of the reasons Israel went into captivity, that God harshly judged people because he calls them thieves.
Yeah, I was wondering if maybe my understanding is wrong of this passage, but I think it might apply the passages that have to do with equal weights and measures. So for those listening, like I get, like in the ancient world, obviously you have a 5-pound weight or whatever, and 10-pound weight, and when I want to buy sugar or something like that, measure it out. But if you were a little sneaky and you said it was a 5-pound weight, but it was really £4, then basically you can get £5 worth of money, or money for £5 of sugar, but you're only giving the person £4 of sugar, so you have a dishonest weight and measure. Do you see those laws applicable to the issue of inflation?
Yes, I definitely do. Deuteronomy 25 verses 13 through 15. God says, "Thou shalt not have in thy bag divers weights, a great and a small. Mm-hmm. Thou shalt not have in thine house divers measures, a great and a small." So the weights and the measures need to be perfect. Verse 15, "But thou shalt have a perfect and just weight, a perfect and just measure shalt thou have, that thy days may be lengthened in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee." So, God's promise to Israel that they'll be in the promised land seemed to depend on them having honest transactions that didn't rob people by manipulating the money or the way to measure the money. We see the effects of inflation in Scripture, where the curses of God, for instance, in Isaiah chapter 1, verses 22 through 23, says, "Thy silver is become dross, thy wine mixed with water," or in other words, diluted. "Thy princes," the rulers, "are rebellious and companions of thieves. Everyone loves gifts and follows after rewards. They judge not the fatherless, neither do the cause of the widow come unto them." So that sounds like inflation there. There's a dilution of wine and silver there. Inflation hurts people on fixed incomes, those living off savings and retirement. The poor, the fatherless, and the widows suffer, as the passage says. They suffer the most, and God calls these rulers thieves for doing that.
So, I know we could definitely go on for hours, so much to talk about there too, but I do want to spend some time. We've painted kind of a depressing picture, at the state of things here. But as Christians who really care about, justice or things like that, God's law or fairness and that kind of thing, what should Christians be either doing or advocating for in order to kind of maybe turn back things a little bit or kind of fix things a little bit? Because it seems like we're so far down this rabbit hole. How do we begin to work our way back?
I definitely think that properly educating people on these matters, as we kind of discussed, is part of them. Parents teach your children about the value of a dollar, the honest labor, and economics, the biblical sound money, and the problems of why the government's so corrupt. As the Bible says, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, which some covet after have pierced them through with many sorrows. And we see that's what the government does by loving money, loving creating money, loving what money buys by stealing from people. And so it starts with education. Christians really need to understand how serious this is, that really the engine for inflation, which is counterfeiting and theft, is the engine for all, virtually all the corruption we see in government. It's ultimately a cause for unjust wars. In Christianity, we have the just war theory, but we haven't really seen a just war for a long time. Like, governments are quick to go to war because they have an inflationary money system that hides the costs of war, and they want to go on foreign adventuring, and people just think that there's really no cost to war. But that's another cause, a moral problem with inflation. So I think educating people about that, if we really understood this, then perhaps Christians would really change their voting and not just be manipulated by, say, the two-party system. They would start to demand that if someone wants their votes, they got to end the corruption. And you can't end the corruption if you have a corrupt government with a corrupt money spigot, allowing them to spend money on things unjustly, rob people, destroy savings. It's completely unbiblical. So we need to understand that and make that a major part of how we fight for justice, true justice, not social justice, but, justice, equality under the law, under God's law, and that, we can start from the ground up, fight for justice in local governments. There's the principle of the lesser magistrate, and then work our way up from there. But anyone who wants your vote will fight against the corruption of the unjust money system.
I was thinking of, because we can pick on, let's say, the Democratic Party, but we could also, there's some blame to be given to the Republicans who have become also fiscally irresponsible, voting for and in support of, stimulus checks and things like that. And I know that there was a time in the past, quasi-recent past, with the Tea Party movement, where there was an attempt to try to introduce some kind of restraint and integrity amongst the politicians, and so I certainly would advocate for that kind of an integrity. And I do think that whether you're Democrat or Republican, you need to hold the people that you vote for accountable for their wicked spending practices. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yes, definitely. And of course, when it comes to the two parties that we have shoved down our throats, it's hard for me to even conceive of voting for a Democrat. They're like just rotten to the core. I cannot vote for anyone who supports abortion or, homosexuality, transgenderism. I'm conservative that way. It's like absolute corruption there. And then I know a lot of Republicans are, it's like they're maybe a little bit better, but, it's like, okay, if the Republicans are our hope, we got to hold their feet to the fire and not, just simply vote for them out of spite for the Democrats. I know I could get crucified by some of my fellow Christian conservatives for that, but I'm not one who favors the two-party system. I'm not one who votes Republican Party ticket because I'm scared of the Democrats. I'm going to vote my conscience and say, hey, if you want my vote, you've got to support the truth, period.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Dan, and I think that's an important perspective to have. And a mature one that I would echo you on that and encourage people to vote in accordance with their conscience and not be necessarily married to one party or the other. I know that our time slips us by, but the last question I wanted to ask is, how can folks get to learn more about you, your ministry, your podcast? Where can they find information about you or go to support you online?
Well, my podcast is Truth Espresso. As I mentioned before, you can get to the website for that. That's www.truthespresso.com, and you can see all the episodes I have there. And Truth Espresso really is about seeking truth in the Word of God. I like to focus on things that a lot of people forget. Truth Espresso has a lot of focus on things like theology proper. I have a lot on Christology, and a lot of Christians don't think much of the depth of doctrines like the Trinity, the incarnation, who Jesus Christ is, and the nature of the atonement, how all that relates, and church history. So I get into that a lot. I try to be a little entertaining with that because I also have a series going on, Is Jesus Like? different superheroes, and each superhero represents a particular error about Jesus from church history. So we get to learn a little bit of church history by thinking about superheroes. And I also deal with some political and economic topics because I hope that I can really educate Christians on things that, might be ignorant about, and realize how serious, as I hope our discussion reveals, how serious and how corrupt things like, the monetary system is. And we might look at the surface sometimes and see like, oh, the government's doing this or that. And you think, well, why are they able to do that? It's because what's the root of the problem? And so we get into there on episodes of Truth Espresso. And that's truthespresso.com, the website for my podcast. Awesome. I'm also on Facebook, Daniel Minnick.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that, Dan. And again, I will definitely ask folks to send you any questions if they have any questions about topics such as economics. Certainly they can ask me as well, but I'll probably just forward them to you because I might not be able to answer them to the level that you can. But I really appreciate you coming on the show today to talk about this important topic. And it's definitely something I'm passionate about too. And I'm also trying to learn how to apply God's law in every area of life, and economics is very complicated, and there's so much to learn about it. But I'm thankful for men like you who are doing that, and also touching on so many other topics, because there's a lot to cover out there, and we all have to be working together to educate others and proclaim the truth. So thank you again for coming out today.
Yes, thank you, Eric. It was definitely a pleasure to be on Governed by God.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed that discussion that I had with Daniel Minnick, and I know I enjoyed it. There was much that we could continue talking about. Economics is an important topic, kind of a complicated one in a lot of ways, but as Christians, there's so many things we need to think about and to think through, especially as we're reflecting on God's law. And so please, I'd encourage you to take a look at the Truth Espresso podcast and look at some of the other topics that Daniel Minnick talks about, especially on the matter of economics. So you can go again to www.truthespresso.com to find more about his podcast.
And so I hope you enjoyed that interview that I had with Eric Luppold of Governed by God. And we've both let each other know since that we would love to be on each other's show in the future. So look forward to more discussions between the two of us about various topics, including biblical law and theology. And so now stay tuned for the next episode of Truth Espresso, where perhaps, God willing, my wife and I will be able to continue our series on the topic of marriage.
Thank you for waking up with Truth Espresso. Good morning, and God bless your day.
Hey friends, Daniel Minnick here again. If you liked waking up to this episode of Truth Espresso, I would really appreciate it if you would rate it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or whatever application you use to listen to Truth Espresso.